It was a calm evening in a quiet suburban
This is
town,
critical.
the kind of
You need to
night when the
move out
roads are
now.
nearly empty and the world seems to slow down. The streetlights cast a soft yellow glow and the sound of crickets filled the air. A black SUV drove smoothly along the highway, its driver sitting tall and steady, wearing the uniform of an army officer. His eyes were tired, but his mind was calm. He had just finished a long day of training at the military base and was heading home, looking forward to a simple meal and some rest before another early morning. For years, his life had been built around discipline, honor, and respect. The army had taught him patience, how to handle fear, how to keep calm when others lost control, and how to stay respectful no matter the situation. That night, he carried the same calm energy as he always did, his hands firm on the steering wheel. The hum of the tires the only sound in the car. He didn't know that within minutes everything he believed about fairness and safety was going to be tested in a way he could never imagine. In the rearview mirror, flashing red and blue lights suddenly filled his view. The sound of a siren cut through the night. He blinked in surprise. He wasn't speeding. He hadn't broken any rules. Still, he slowed down immediately, signaling to show he had seen the patrol car behind him. He looked around for a safe, well-lit place to pull over. It was something every soldier knew to do. Find light, stay visible, stay calm. There was a gas station a little ahead, and he steered toward it. But before he could reach it, the police car behind him seemed to grow impatient. The sirens grew louder, and the distance between them closed quickly. Through the mirror, he could see two officers inside, one of them gesturing aggressively, shouting something he couldn't hear. He raised his hand briefly to show acknowledgement and kept driving slowly toward the light ahead. He stopped his car just outside the gas station under a bright streetlight. The air was still. His heart was steady. He rolled down his window and placed both hands visibly on the steering wheel. Calm, composed, trained. When the officer approached, he kept his voice steady, polite, and professional. He introduced himself by rank, explaining that he was in uniform and that he had stopped here for safety and visibility. But the officer didn't seem to care about any of that. The moment he reached the window, his tone was harsh. He barked orders instead of words. "License and registration," he shouted. The lieutenant nodded, speaking softly. "Sir, may I ask what the stop is for?" His voice carried no defiance, only calm curiosity. Yet the question seemed to irritate the officer even more. The second officer stood slightly behind, his hand resting near his belt, his face uncertain. He looked like he wanted to speak, but didn't. The lead officer took a step closer, leaning in, his voice filled with suspicion. "Why didn't you pull over immediately when I told you to?" he demanded. The lieutenant replied in the same calm tone, explaining that he had wanted to stop somewhere well lit for everyone's safety. He even smiled slightly, trying to diffuse the tension, but there was no softening the mood. The lead officer's hand twitched near his holster. The lieutenant noticed it but stayed composed. He had faced worse under far greater pressure. He had been trained to remain steady even when surrounded by chaos. "Sir," he said quietly, "I'm fully cooperating." He kept both hands visible, moving slowly whenever asked. But instead of recognizing his discipline, the officer saw it as hesitation, a refusal to obey fast enough. The officer shouted again, louder this time, "Step out of the vehicle." The words echoed through the still night. The lieutenant hesitated for just a second, trying to understand the situation. "Sir, can you please tell me what's happening?" he asked again calmly. That question was enough to set the officer off further. He took another step closer, yelling louder, his partner now visibly tense. Inside the car, the lieutenant's pulse quickened, but he kept his voice level. He knew sudden movements could make things worse. He kept his hands on the wheel, repeating that he was unarmed, that he was following orders, that he meant no harm. The officer's anger, however, seemed to rise with every calm word. At that moment, passers-by at the gas station began to notice. A couple filling up their car turned their heads. A store clerk stepped out of the shop, watching quietly, his face unsure. The scene was beginning to draw attention. The lieutenant thought that might help. Witnesses meant accountability. Maybe this would calm things down, but it didn't. The officer's tone became louder, almost shaking with frustration. "Get out now!" he shouted again. The lieutenant slowly reached for the door handle. "I'm stepping out," he said clearly, keeping his movements visible and slow. He opened the door and stood tall under the streetlight, the silver bars on his shoulders gleaming under the pale glow. His uniform was spotless, his boots shining. He looked every bit the soldier he was, calm, steady, dignified, yet even that sight didn't stop the hostility. The officer ordered him to get on his knees. The lieutenant hesitated again, confused by the aggression. "Sir," he said softly, "I've done nothing wrong. Please, let's talk calmly." He wasn't refusing. He was trying to reason, to bring some sense into a situation spinning out of control. The tension was thick now. The second officer shifted nervously, looking at the lieutenant, then at his partner. The lead officer's hand moved closer to his weapon, his anger boiling over. "I said on your knees," he shouted again, his voice shaking the air. The lieutenant took a slow breath, hands still raised. "Please," he said gently, "there's no need for this. I'm cooperating." Every second felt like an eternity. The silence between the shouts was heavier than the noise itself. The bystanders stayed frozen, unsure if they should intervene or stay back. Some quietly began recording on their phones, sensing something terrible might happen. The lieutenant took another careful step forward, trying to calm the situation. "I'm not a threat," he repeated. His tone was still respectful, still the voice of someone who believed in order and peace. He had survived war zones and dangerous missions, but never had he imagined fear like this. Standing in his own country in uniform, facing someone meant to protect people like him. The next moments were confusing and fast. The officer suddenly stepped closer, raising his voice again while the second officer tried weakly to de-escalate. The lieutenant's voice was drowned out by shouting. The flashing lights bounced off the nearby cars, casting sharp colors across the scene. It was chaos. Not of violence yet, but of confusion, fear, and power gone wrong. Inside, the lieutenant thought of his family. His wife, who always worried when he came home late. His kids, who loved seeing him in uniform and saluting him playfully. He thought of the people he trained with, the ones who trusted him to lead with integrity and calm judgment. He thought of how he had promised them, and himself, to always do the right thing. And now in this surreal moment he was trying to do just that. He didn't shout. He didn't fight. He stood still, hoping that reason would return to the situation, that maybe the officer would see who he really was, not a suspect, not a danger, but a man who had dedicated his life to serving the same flag on both of their shoulders. But the anger didn't fade. The air was tense with something unspoken, fear, misunderstanding, and prejudice mixed into one. The scene had gone far beyond a traffic stop. The officer's partner looked uneasy, glancing at the cameras, the growing crowd, and the officer's trembling hand. The lieutenant's calm voice broke through one last time. "Please, sir, let's not make this worse." It was both a plea and a warning, not out of fear for himself, but for the consequences that could follow if things went further. The officer didn't respond. His face was rigid, his breathing sharp. The world seemed to hold its breath, and then in a flash everything changed. The sound that followed would echo in people's memories for months. The gas station lights flickered, someone screamed, and the night that had started so calmly ended in chaos. The lieutenant fell to the ground, the uniform he had worn with pride now marking him as another victim of a misunderstanding that should never have happened. The officer froze for a moment, as if realizing too late what had been done. The second officer rushed forward, shouting for help, but the silence that followed was heavier than any noise. Within minutes, more patrol cars arrived. The crowd grew. The cameras kept recording. And somewhere in that confusion, a truth began to form. A truth that would soon reach the highest offices of the country and shake the nation's conscience. The night that began with flashing lights ended with sirens wailing into the darkness. Somewhere far away, the Pentagon phone lines started to ring, and that was only the beginning. The night grew colder as flashing lights painted the quiet street red and blue. People gathered behind the yellow tape, whispering in disbelief, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The police radios crackled, voices overlapping in panic. The lead officer stood frozen, his expression pale and distant. He seemed to realize what he had done, but the shock on his face couldn't undo anything now. Paramedics rushed in, their movements quick but tense. The second officer, the younger one, stood back watching helplessly. He looked like he wanted to speak, but no words came. The sound of the ambulance door shutting broke the silence for a moment. Then the vehicles sped away, leaving behind only confusion, fear, and questions. At the military base nearby, the news spread faster than anyone expected. A call came into the duty office. One of their own had been hurt during a traffic stop. At first, nobody believed it. It didn't make sense. The man everyone knew was calm, respectful, and steady. He wasn't the kind of person to argue or resist authority, but as more details came in, disbelief turned into shock. The words "officer-involved shooting" echoed through the halls like a haunting whisper. By morning, the story had reached national headlines. Major networks picked it up, showing a brief clip from a bystander's phone. The video didn't show everything, but what it showed was enough to make millions stop and stare. A uniformed army officer, calm and respectful, facing hostility for no reason. The clip spread online, shared by people who didn't even know him but felt his fear and confusion as if it were their own. At the Pentagon, senior officials gathered early that morning. Phones rang nonstop, statements were prepared, and questions poured in from every direction. How could a decorated army officer, someone who had served his country with honor, end up being treated like that? The Secretary of Defense demanded a full report. The mood was grim, and every face around the table showed anger hidden behind controlled professionalism. Meanwhile, the town where it happened was already surrounded by reporters. News vans lined the streets, cameras pointed at the police department. Protesters began gathering, holding signs calling for justice and accountability. The local police chief tried to calm the situation with a short press conference, saying an investigation was underway, but the words felt hollow. People had seen the video. They had heard the calm tone of the soldier and the anger of the officer. The truth was already visible to anyone who cared to look. At the hospital, the hallways were filled with uniformed men and women. They stood silently outside a room guarded by security. The air was heavy with grief. They had lost one of their own, and no words could describe what that felt like. The chaplain stood in a corner, head bowed. No one spoke, but everyone knew what they were thinking. This wasn't just about one man. It was about the respect every service member deserves, even outside the battlefield. The lieutenant's family arrived later that day. Their faces showed exhaustion, pain, and disbelief. His wife could barely speak. His parents sat in silence, holding each other's hands tightly. The officers who escorted them said nothing. Their silence was the only comfort they could offer. Reporters waited outside, but the family refused to speak. They didn't want cameras or interviews. They just wanted answers. Inside the Pentagon, meetings continued late into the night. The case was now under federal review, and the military wanted to make sure the truth came out. The footage from the police body camera was requested immediately. Once investigators watched it, the atmosphere in the room shifted from confusion to outrage. The lieutenant had done nothing wrong. He had been calm, polite, and professional throughout. Every command he followed was done with respect, yet he was met with aggression and fear. A statement was drafted within hours. The Pentagon condemned the incident and demanded accountability. It wasn't just a public relations move. It was genuine frustration from those who had seen one of their own treated unjustly. Military spokespeople reminded the public that every person wearing that uniform represented the nation, and harming one was a stain on the values the country stood for. The lead officer was placed on immediate suspension. His partner was questioned for hours. When investigators asked what had happened, the younger officer's voice trembled. He admitted he had felt something was wrong but didn't know how to stop it. His words added to the growing storm. Back in the town, people filled the streets with candles and flowers. A makeshift memorial grew near the gas station where the incident had happened. Photos of the lieutenant in uniform, smiling proudly, were surrounded by flags and handwritten notes. Strangers came from other towns just to stand there quietly, some in tears, some in silence, some still angry but trying to stay peaceful. News anchors spoke about him not just as a victim, but as a hero who stayed calm until the end. Fellow soldiers shared stories online about his kindness, how he always helped younger officers train, how he volunteered for difficult missions, how he never raised his voice in anger. The image that formed was not just of a man in uniform, but of a human being who deserved better. Within days, the Department of Justice became involved. The state governor called for an independent investigation, and the FBI stepped in to handle the case. The mayor of the town publicly apologized to the family, promising full transparency. But promises weren't enough. People wanted real action. The more details that came out, the worse it looked for the police department. Reports revealed that the lead officer had multiple complaints in the past for aggressive behavior, but none were taken seriously. Those old files now became the center of attention. The town council faced pressure, the chief faced scrutiny, and the department's reputation began to crumble. At the same time, the military honored the lieutenant in a private ceremony. Rows of soldiers stood in silence as his flag-draped photograph was placed at the center of the hall. The chaplain spoke softly, reminding everyone that courage isn't just about facing danger in war, but also about standing with dignity in the face of injustice. Many in the room held back tears. The moment was painful but also powerful. It reminded everyone of what they stood for: respect, equality, and truth. The Pentagon's next move was unprecedented. They sent official representatives to the town to oversee the investigation, ensuring transparency. Military lawyers coordinated with federal prosecutors. It was clear that this wasn't going to be buried quietly. The nation was watching. As the investigation deepened, the lead officer's story began to fall apart. His claims of feeling threatened didn't match the footage or witness accounts. His partner's testimony contradicted his version entirely. Every piece of evidence pointed to a misuse of power and an act driven by anger rather than fear. Public pressure grew. Talk shows discussed it nightly. Veterans organizations released statements demanding justice. For many, this wasn't just about one tragedy. It was about a pattern that had gone on for too long. But for those who knew the lieutenant personally, it was still deeply personal. They didn't want him remembered as a headline, but as a man who lived with honor and treated everyone with respect. As the days turned into weeks, the courtroom became the focus of the nation's attention. The officer was charged with multiple counts and his trial would soon begin. The town, once known for its quiet streets, was now at the center of a national debate about accountability and justice. At night, the lieutenant's family stayed out of the spotlight. They wanted peace, not attention, but they found some comfort in the outpouring of love from people they had never met. Letters arrived from across the country, from soldiers, teachers, parents, and even children, all saying the same thing: he deserved better. The Pentagon prepared to send a formal delegation to attend the trial. They wanted to show the world that the military stood by its people, no matter where they served. Behind closed doors, leaders talked about reform, about better ways to ensure service members were treated with the respect they had earned. And in the small town where it all began, something began to change. The same streets that once felt divided started to come together. Neighbors who had never spoken to each other began sharing stories and standing side by side. The tragedy had shaken them, but it had also reminded them of something simple: humanity matters more than rank, color, or uniform. Late one evening, as candles flickered near the memorial, a quiet group of soldiers stood together. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The light reflected in their eyes said everything: grief, respect, and the unspoken promise that his story wouldn't be forgotten. The night air was cool, the sky full of stars. Somewhere beyond the noise in the headlines, the truth was finally beginning to find its voice. The road to justice was only beginning, but the world was watching now, and no one was going to look away this time. The morning of the hearing began with gray skies and quiet streets. The courthouse stood surrounded by reporters and cameras, all waiting for something that had already captured the nation's attention. Every window of the nearby buildings seemed to have faces pressed against the glass, watching, waiting. It wasn't just another legal case anymore, it had become a symbol, a test of justice itself. Inside the courthouse, the air felt heavy. Soldiers in uniform sat silently on one side, their faces calm but eyes filled with quiet anger. Across from them sat townspeople, journalists, and supporters holding small flags. The lieutenant's family entered quietly, supported by officers who stood with them. They didn't speak to the cameras or look at the crowd. Their pain spoke louder than any words could. The officer responsible was brought in under heavy escort. His face was pale, eyes downcast. The moment he entered, a ripple of silence passed through the room. Even those who had come out of curiosity could feel the weight of what was happening. This was not just about a mistake. It was about accountability, truth and respect for the uniform that represented the nation. The first witness called was the second officer, the younger one who had stood by that night. He looked nervous but determined. His voice trembled slightly as he described what happened. He told the court that the lieutenant had been calm, polite, and compliant from the very beginning. He admitted that he had felt something was wrong but didn't know how to intervene. His eyes lowered when he said those words, as if replaying the moment in his head, wishing he had done more. The defense tried to argue that the situation had been confusing, that the lead officer had felt threatened. But every time that argument was made, the prosecutor calmly pointed back to the video. The footage spoke for itself. The lieutenant had never raised his voice. He had never shown aggression. Every gesture was measured and respectful. Watching it again in court, people shook their heads in disbelief. Outside the courthouse, crowds held candles and signs. Some carried photos of the lieutenant in uniform, smiling with pride. Veterans stood shoulder to shoulder, silent but united. The mood wasn't one of revenge, but of quiet determination. They wanted truth, not anger. Back in the courtroom, one by one, witnesses came forward. A bystander who had recorded part of the incident told the court what they saw. Their voice cracked as they explained how they had thought it was just a normal stop, until the shouting began. Another witness, a gas station worker, described how the lieutenant had spoken calmly, trying to de-escalate. Each account added another piece to the picture, and that picture was becoming painfully clear. As the days passed, the nation followed every update. News channels discussed the case respectfully, showing clips of the hearing and interviews with experts. The Pentagon released another statement, reaffirming their commitment to stand with the lieutenant's family. Military officials even attended the hearings, sitting quietly behind the family to show their support. In the courtroom, the prosecutor's closing statement was simple but powerful. They didn't raise their voice or try to dramatize anything. They simply said, "This was a man who spent his life serving his country, and in the end he showed more discipline and restraint than the person who was supposed to protect him." The room was silent when they finished. Even the defense lawyer looked down, knowing the truth was undeniable. The jury took 2 days to deliberate. 2 long, tense days. Outside, people waited from morning until night, sharing food, prayers, and hope. News crews broadcast live updates while online communities around the world followed the story, sending messages of solidarity. It wasn't just an American story anymore. It had become a human one. When the verdict was finally read, the courtroom was so quiet you could hear the sound of paper turning. The officer was found guilty on all major charges. Some people gasped. Others closed their eyes in silent relief. The lieutenant's family held hands, tears streaming down their faces. There were no cheers or shouting, only a deep, emotional stillness, the kind that comes when justice, long delayed, finally arrives. Outside, the crowd erupted into applause and tears. People hugged strangers. Veterans saluted quietly, some with tears in their eyes. Candles flickered brighter in the evening air. For the first time since that tragic night, there was a sense that something right had been done. At the Pentagon, word of the verdict spread quickly. Officials released a statement praising the justice system for its courage and transparency. They announced plans to honor the lieutenant posthumously with a medal for his service and courage. His name would be remembered not only for his sacrifice but for the change his story inspired. The media began referring to the case as a turning point, a rare moment where accountability prevailed. Debates on television focused on lessons learned, not anger. Leaders from across the political spectrum called for reform and better training for officers. Schools and academies began including discussions about respect, equality, and handling authority with integrity. In the weeks that followed, the small town where it all began slowly returned to normal life, but something had changed. The gas station where the incident happened was no longer just a stop along the road. It had become a place of remembrance. People continued to leave flowers and notes, many thanking the lieutenant for reminding the world what true dignity looks like. His family stayed away from the spotlight, preferring quiet and privacy. They received letters from across the country, from soldiers, police officers, and everyday citizens, all expressing sorrow, gratitude, and respect. One letter came from a young cadet who wrote, Because of him, I want to wear the uniform the right way." That letter, among hundreds, became one of the family's most cherished keepsakes. Months later, a ceremony was held at the military base where the lieutenant had served. It was a bright, clear morning. Rows of soldiers stood in formation as the national anthem played. The family sat in the front row, surrounded by commanders and fellow officers. A framed portrait of the lieutenant stood beside the podium, his calm smile frozen in time. The commanding officer spoke softly, his voice filled with emotion. He said, "The lieutenant's legacy wasn't just about service, it was about how he lived." He reminded everyone that courage doesn't always mean fighting on the battlefield. Sometimes it means standing calm and dignified when faced with injustice. The audience stood silently, listening, their eyes glistening in the morning sun. When the medal was presented to the family, there wasn't a dry eye in the crowd. The gentle sound of the bugle echoed across the field, carried by the wind. Soldiers saluted, standing tall, their hearts heavy but proud. It was a moment that felt both heartbreaking and healing, a recognition that his story had meaning, that his life had changed others for the better. The Pentagon later released a documentary honoring him, showing his years of service, the impact of his story, and the reforms it inspired. It featured interviews with his colleagues who described him as patient, fair, and deeply kind. Watching those who had served with him speak brought a sense of humanity to the story that no headline ever could. In the same town, the police department underwent major changes. The chief resigned, new leadership took over, and a community board was established to ensure transparency. Training programs were updated to focus on empathy and communication. Even some officers admitted that the case had opened their eyes, that they had learned something vital about respect and restraint. Every year, on the anniversary of the incident, people gathered at the memorial. They came not just to mourn, but to reflect. Children placed small flags, veterans shared quiet stories, and teachers brought students to explain why remembering mattered. The lieutenant's story became part of local history, a reminder that one moment of injustice can spark a lifetime of change. The officer who had been convicted faced his sentence in silence. He never spoke publicly again, and few people ever saw him after that day in court. The world moved on, but his actions remained a lesson, a harsh reminder of what unchecked anger can destroy. As time passed, the family tried to rebuild their lives. It wasn't easy. The pain never really disappeared, but they found peace in knowing that their loved one's legacy was now tied to something bigger than tragedy. He had become a symbol of integrity, calmness, and strength, proof that even in the darkest moments, dignity could still shine through. Years later, when people spoke about him, they didn't just talk about what happened that night. They talked about how he lived, about the respect he gave others, the calm he carried, and the strength of his character. His story continued to inspire soldiers, police officers, and civilians alike. And though the road that led there had been painful, it reminded everyone of a simple truth. Justice might take time, but it does come. And when it does, it brings not revenge, but healing. The courthouse that once echoed with tension now stood, quiet, its steps often covered in flowers left by strangers who never met him but felt they knew him. The light post still held ribbons and small notes written by children. "Thank you for your courage," one read. "You made the world better," said another. And somewhere, beyond the noise of the world, his spirit lived on. Not in anger or sorrow, but in every person who chose to do the right thing, even when it was hard. The story had begun on a dark, lonely road, but it ended in light. Months had passed since the trial ended, but the story hadn't faded from people's hearts. The memory of that night and everything that followed still lingered like a shadow across the country. For some, it was a painful reminder of how unfair life could be. For others, it became a symbol of change, proof that truth could still win even after so much pain. Everywhere, people were still talking about him. His story was shown in classrooms, shared in community meetings, and discussed on news shows. It wasn't the tragedy people focused on anymore, but the lesson behind it, the power of calm, respect, and standing tall even when faced with injustice. In the Pentagon, new programs were being created in his memory. The leadership called it the Honor Initiative. It aimed to build understanding between military personnel and local law enforcement across the country. The goal was simple: to prevent anything like that night from happening again. The program trained both soldiers and officers to handle encounters with empathy, communication, and awareness. At first, some people doubted whether these changes would last. Many had seen reforms come and go before, but this time felt different. The face of the lieutenant, his quiet strength, his calm eyes, had reached people's hearts. His name had become more than a headline. It had become a symbol of what respect and discipline should look like. The small town where it all began slowly began to heal too. The police department had new leadership, and with it came a new spirit. Officers began attending workshops about communication and accountability. The new chief often spoke publicly about rebuilding trust, saying that it started with listening, not defending. The townspeople appreciated it, though the scars remained. One morning, the lieutenant's family visited the memorial site again. The gas station had turned part of its lot into a small garden surrounded by flags and flowers. A bronze plaque stood at the center, engraved with simple words: "He stayed calm when others lost control." People still came to leave flowers and messages. Some brought their children to teach them about patience and respect. A young boy placed a small toy soldier beside the plaque, whispering to his mother, "He was a real hero, right?" She nodded quietly, eyes filled with tears. At the military base, his old colleagues continued to speak about him often. They shared stories of his leadership, how he encouraged them to stay grounded no matter what. One officer remembered how he once said, "If you lose your temper, you lose control. But if you stay calm, you can fix almost anything." Those words now appeared on posters across training facilities. They had become a reminder of the kind of discipline that went beyond orders and rules, the kind that came from character. Across the country, universities invited military speakers and community leaders to discuss his story. Students listened closely, taking notes not just for grades but for understanding. The story had turned into a lesson about humanity, about treating others with dignity, even when authority and fear collide. Meanwhile, the Pentagon launched a scholarship in his name for military families pursuing public service careers. His family attended the first ceremony. They sat quietly as the award was given to a young woman studying criminal justice. She spoke softly at the podium, saying she wanted to become a police officer who listens before reacting. Her voice trembled with emotion, and the audience gave a long, heartfelt applause. Even in the world of media, his story changed things. News outlets that once focused on sensational headlines began covering stories of compassion, service, and unity more often. Producers admitted privately that people wanted hope, not just outrage. And his story had shown that healing could be more powerful than hate. The lieutenant's family began receiving invitations to speak at public events, but they only accepted a few. They didn't seek fame or attention. When they spoke softly, always emphasizing one thing: forgiveness. They said holding on to hate would only continue the pain, and their loved one would never have wanted that. The audience often fell silent at those words. Forgiveness wasn't easy, but hearing it from those who had suffered most made it real. 1 year after the incident, a national ceremony was held in Washington. Military leaders, government officials, and community representatives gathered to honor him. The hall was filled with flags, photographs, and people from every walk of life. The president gave a short speech, praising his courage and calmness. "He showed us," the president said, "that strength is not about power. It's about control, respect, and compassion." The crowd stood in applause that lasted several minutes. His family held hands tightly, tears falling silently. It wasn't just grief anymore. It was pride. Pride that his life had meant something far greater than anyone could have imagined. After the ceremony, a moment of silence was held across all military bases. Soldiers paused their duties, saluted, and reflected. Many had never met him, but they felt like they knew him. His story had reached them in ways no speech ever could. As time went on, the reforms began to show results. Reports of tense encounters between police and service members dropped noticeably. Departments began working more closely with military advisors. Training programs emphasized calm communication and respect for uniforms of all kinds. The lieutenant's name was often mentioned as the inspiration behind these changes. In the small town, life slowly settled into a new normal. The police officers now made efforts to attend community gatherings, schools, and neighborhood events. They played basketball with local kids, helped with cleanup drives, and volunteered during holidays. Trust, once broken, was starting to mend piece by piece. The local school even named a scholarship after the lieutenant, given to students who demonstrated leadership through kindness and respect. At the award ceremony, one student said, "He taught us that being brave doesn't mean shouting louder. It means staying calm when it's hardest." The audience clapped softly, touched by the simplicity of those words. At home, the lieutenant's family kept his uniform framed in their living room. His medals hung beside it. Sometimes his children would sit quietly in front of it, asking questions about their father, what he was like, what he believed in, why everyone spoke of him with such love. Their mother would smile gently and say, "He believed in being kind even when it's hard. That's what made him special." Every now and then, veterans would stop by to pay their respects. They would share stories, laughter, and sometimes tears. They spoke about how his calm strength reminded them of the best kind of soldier, one who led with heart, not pride. In the second year after the verdict, a major news network released a feature documentary about the changes his story inspired. It followed the reform programs, the scholarship fund, and interviews with people whose lives had been touched. The documentary ended with footage of the lieutenant standing tall in his uniform, smiling at the camera during a training day years before the incident. His calm eyes looked straight into the lens, almost as if he were reminding everyone watching to stay strong, stay patient, and stay human. The response to the documentary was overwhelming. Millions watched, many leaving messages online about how it changed their view of respect and authority. One comment read, "He reminded us that being calm isn't weakness, it's real strength." That single sentence became one of the documentary's most quoted lines. In the following months, new laws were proposed to improve coordination between local police departments and federal agencies. The Pentagon also announced an annual award in his name for those who demonstrated exceptional integrity and service. The first recipient was a young sergeant who had peacefully resolved a tense standoff without violence. When she accepted the award, she said, "I just did what he would have done." Through every reform, every story, and every ceremony, his spirit continued to live. He had become more than just a soldier. He had become a teacher to an entire nation, someone who taught patience through his silence and courage through his calm. Years later, the town still held an annual march on the day of the verdict. But it wasn't a protest anymore. It was a walk of unity. People from all backgrounds joined hands, walking quietly through the streets, carrying candles instead of signs. Children led the way, holding small flags and wearing t-shirts that read, "Stay calm, stay strong." That night, as candles flickered along the roads and soft prayers filled the air, it felt as if the lieutenant's spirit was walking among them, not as a symbol of tragedy, but as a reminder of hope. The world had changed because one man had stayed calm when it mattered most. His story had begun with injustice, but it had ended with inspiration, a legacy built not on anger, but on the strength of quiet courage and the belief that one person's dignity can light the path for many. And so, even years later, when people spoke his name, they didn't speak it with sadness. They spoke it with respect, because he had shown the world that true honor isn't given by medals or ranks. It's earned by how you carry yourself when everything around you falls apart. Years had gone by since the night that changed everything. The world had moved forward, but the story of the Army lieutenant still remained in people's hearts. It was no longer just a moment in history. It had turned into a movement, one that taught people about strength, patience, and respect. His legacy had become a quiet force that continued to inspire, long after the headlines had faded. Across the country, many young people had grown up hearing his story. For them, he wasn't just a soldier who faced injustice. He was someone who stood for calmness in chaos, for control when everything felt out of control. Teachers spoke about him in classrooms, showing how one person's grace could change an entire system. At military academies, new cadets learned about his life during ethics training. In one class, an instructor stood before a room of recruits and said, "There's a difference between power and control." He showed us that. The room stayed silent. Every young face looked up, knowing this wasn't just another lesson from a book. It was about a real person, someone who had lived what they were being taught. Meanwhile, the reforms inspired by his story had started shaping the country in visible ways. Police departments across the states now had empathy programs designed to teach officers how to communicate under pressure. Role-playing sessions, listening exercises, and scenario-based training were becoming standard. The goal wasn't just to enforce the law, but to protect human dignity. At one of these training sessions, an officer instructor paused in front of a group and said, "Every uniform has a story behind it, a family, a purpose, a dream. When we forget that, we lose sight of who we are supposed to be." His words hung in the air, echoing the same truth the lieutenant had embodied years ago. The Pentagon's Honor Initiative continued to grow, becoming one of the most successful interagency programs in history. It was no longer just a training program, it was a culture shift. The Department of Defense and law enforcement agencies worked together on community outreach projects. Veterans volunteered to speak in schools, encouraging young people to see both soldiers and police officers as protectors, not enemies. Every year on the anniversary of the incident, communities held remembrance events. But these weren't moments of sadness, and they were moments of unity. People shared stories, sang songs about hope, and released lanterns into the night sky. Each light symbolized peace and understanding. The lieutenant's family continued to live quietly, but they received letters from around the world. Soldiers, police officers, teachers, and even students wrote to them about how his story had changed their lives. One letter came from a young officer in another country. It read, "I was taught that power means control over others. Your husband taught me that power means control over myself." The family framed that letter and kept it beside his photograph. The scholarship fund in his name had also grown. It now supported hundreds of students each year, children of soldiers, police officers, and public servants. The application essay asked one question: what does integrity mean to you? The answers were often heartfelt and deeply personal. Many students said they wanted to make the world better, just like the man whose name stood on the scholarship certificate. At one ceremony, a young boy stepped on stage to receive the award. He was barely 16, but spoke with the calmness of someone much older. "I want to serve my country like he did," he said. "But I also want to serve people with kindness, because I think that's what makes someone truly strong." The audience stood and applauded, not just for the boy, but for what those words represented, the lasting echo of a man's quiet courage. Meanwhile, filmmakers began exploring the idea of turning his story into a film. His family was hesitant at first, worried that it might sensationalize what happened. But after long discussions, they agreed, only if the story focused on his character, his discipline, and his humanity. The producers promised to make it about hope, not pain. When the film was finally released, it moved millions. It showed not just the incident, but the man behind the uniform, his family, his values, and his calmness in the face of chaos. The movie ended with a powerful line: "He didn't fight with anger. He stood with dignity." In theaters across the country, audiences sat in silence when the credits rolled. Many left with tears, but also with a renewed sense of faith in humanity. The film won several awards, but the family didn't attend most ceremonies. They preferred to stay out of the spotlight. What mattered to them wasn't fame. It was that people understood who he truly was. One evening, after watching the movie in private, his wife said softly, "Now the world knows him the way we did." Years passed and the world continued to change. Technology advanced, new leaders rose, and social issues kept evolving. Yet every time there was tension or misunderstanding between people and authority, his story resurfaced as a reminder of how calmness could prevent chaos. In a small high school one day, a teacher asked her students to write about a hero who inspired them. Almost half the class chose him. One student wrote, "He didn't raise his voice, but the world heard him louder than anyone." That essay later won a National Writing Award. The Pentagon Museum even built a permanent display about him, a small, simple section with his uniform, a photo, and a short video about the reforms his story inspired. Visitors often lingered there, not because of the tragedy, but because of the peace the story carried. People left feeling thoughtful, inspired to be better. At the same time, the officer who had once caused all the pain remained a name that people rarely spoke of anymore. His case had ended long ago and society had moved on. What people remembered was not his wrongdoing, but the good that grew from it. The reforms, the awareness, the unity. Even that painful night had been transformed into something meaningful. Around the 5th anniversary, a national news outlet ran a story titled The Legacy of Calm. It highlighted how one man's patience reshaped entire institutions. In the interview, one Pentagon spokesperson said, "He didn't just change policy. He changed people." Those simple words summed up everything that had happened in the years since. On the same day, his family held a small gathering at home. Friends, neighbors, and a few soldiers came over. They shared stories and laughter. There was no sadness in the air, only warmth. His children, now older, spoke about their father with pride. One of them said, "People always say he was calm. But to us, he was also fun. He loved to laugh. I want people to remember that part too." Everyone smiled at that. It was a reminder that beyond the headlines and the ceremonies, he had been a loving husband and father, a man who simply believed in doing what was right. Later that evening, as the house grew quiet, his wife stepped outside and looked at the sky. The stars were bright that night, scattered like tiny lights of hope. She whispered softly, "You did it. You made them see." Far away on military bases, soldiers were preparing for night drills. Some of them carried small cards with his name printed on them, a token given to remind them of patience under pressure. Many soldiers kept them in their wallets or uniforms as good luck charms. When they faced difficult moments, they'd touch the card and take a deep breath. It was their way of staying grounded, just like he did. Even abroad, his story had crossed borders. In different parts of the world, officers and soldiers quoted his name during seminars and peacekeeping missions. His calmness had become an international example of leadership and self-control. Over time, books and journals were written about his legacy, not as a political story, but as a human one. His journey had become a study of moral strength and how one person's behavior under pressure could inspire generations. Universities used his example in leadership programs. Professors spoke about how true discipline wasn't about shouting orders, but about quiet confidence and fairness. And in that way, his spirit lived on, not in statues or speeches, but in everyday actions. A police officer choosing to stay calm during an argument, a soldier choosing to listen before reacting, a student standing up for what's right without losing respect. These small choices, spread across countless people, became the true tribute to his life. The world had changed in many ways since that night, but one thing remained the same. People still remembered him. Not as a victim, but as a symbol of what patience and honor could do, even in the hardest of times. In the end, his legacy wasn't carved in stone. It was carried in hearts, in every person who learned that staying calm doesn't mean staying silent and that dignity, even when tested, always finds its way to victory.